If you find it interesting, please remember to subscribe to the channel to support the channel, so that the channel has the motivation to continue to release good stories to serve the audience. Story 1. It was a night I'll never forget, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to let go. The snowstorm had been raging for hours, turning the streets of Everwood into an alien expanse of swirling white. By the time I finished at the office and stepped into the freezing night, I felt completely alone. When I reached my car in the empty lot, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. "Don't look back," it read in sharp, jagged letters. I crumpled the note, feeling unease creep up my spine, but I ignored it. I drove home slowly, my headlights barely cutting through the whiteout, and the radio crackling with static. As I pulled into my driveway, the sight of footprints leading to my door made my stomach drop. "Who?" I whispered aloud, my breath visible in the cold air. I stepped inside cautiously. The house was dark, colder than usual. The air was heavy, almost oppressive. Then, from the shadows of the kitchen, a voice rasped. "Close the door." I spun around, my heart pounding. Sitting at my kitchen table was a man, his face partially hidden by a scarf, snow melting into a puddle beneath his boots. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "That doesn't matter," he said, his voice eerily calm. "You shouldn't be here." "This is my house," I snapped, anger overtaking my fear. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his dark eyes bored into mine, and his voice dropped lower. "They're coming," he whispered. "You've already let them in." "Who's coming?" Before he could respond, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. My breath caught. "I live alone." The man stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. "Don't go up there." "What's upstairs?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to," he said sharply. "If you go up there, you won't come back down." I hesitated, but another thud, louder this time, made the decision for me. I grabbed a flashlight and started for the stairs. "Stop!" he shouted, grabbing my arm. "If you see it, it will see you." I yanked my arm free. "What are you talking about?" "See what?" "If you won't explain, I'm going to find out myself." "Listen to me." He barked, his calm demeanor cracking. "You're safer not knowing." I ignored him and climbed the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the kind of cold that felt alive. When I reached the landing, my bedroom door was ajar, faint light spilling out. "Emily, stop!" the man called from below. But I was already pushing the door open. Inside, standing by the window, was me. Or something that looked like me. It turned its head slowly, unnaturally, until it faced me. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth stretched into a grin that was far too wide. "Why didn't you listen?" it said in my voice, its tone mockingly sweet. I stumbled back, nearly falling. My flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it at the thing. "Who? What are you?" I stammered. It tilted its head, the grin growing impossibly larger. "Don't you recognize me?" it purred. "I'm you." "No, you're not." I screamed, backing away. "Emily." The man's voice called from the doorway. "Don't look at it too long." The creature's head snapped toward him, its grin vanishing. "You shouldn't have brought him," it said darkly. "Now he'll see too." The man stepped into the room, his expression grim. "You have to leave, now." "Not until I know what's happening." I shouted. "Emily," the man said urgently, "this house isn't yours anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. If you stay, they'll take you." "They?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The creature let out a low, guttural laugh. "Oh, he hasn't told you?" "Shut up." The man barked at the creature. But it continued, its voice dripping with malice. He knows what happens when you ignore the warnings. He ignored his, too. What does that mean? I asked, my head spinning. The man looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. I made the mistake of staying once. They let me go, but not entirely. Now I'm just a shadow, stuck between them and the world. The creature laughed again, louder this time. And now you've brought her to us. How generous. Run. The man shouted. But my feet felt rooted to the floor. The creature took a step closer, its body jerking unnaturally. Don't you want to stay, Emily? You'll never have to leave again, it whispered, reaching for me with a hand that was too long, too thin. The man grabbed my arm, yanking me back toward the door. Don't listen to it. As we bolted down the stairs, the creature's voice echoed behind us. You can't run forever, Emily. We'll be waiting. When we reached the front door, the man pushed me outside into the storm. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. Keep running, he said, his voice desperate. What about you? I asked, turning back to him. He shook his head. I can't leave. But you can. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the swirling snow. I ran and didn't stop until the house was far behind me. When I finally dared to look back, the house was gone, just an empty stretch of snow where it should have been. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. But sometimes, when the snow falls and the wind howls just right, I hear the creature's voice whispering my name. And I wonder if I ever truly escaped. Story 2. The storm had come faster than anyone predicted, swallowing the world outside in a relentless swirl of white. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, a weekend at Black Hollow Lodge deep in the mountains, away from the noise of the city. Just me, Clara, and Daniel, enjoying the solitude of the forest. But by the time we arrived, the silence of the storm felt suffocating rather than serene. Are you sure this is the right turn? Clara asked from the passenger seat, her eyes squinting at the snow-covered road ahead. Positive, Daniel replied from the back seat, his voice too chipper for the growing tension in the car. The lodge is just up ahead. Trust me. The headlights barely cut through the thick snow as I drove cautiously up the winding path. When the building finally came into view, it was almost a relief, until I saw it. The lodge was smaller than I'd imagined, its dark silhouette barely visible against the storm. But it wasn't the size that made me uneasy. Why are the windows boarded up? Clara asked, her tone sharp. They're probably just preparing for the storm, Daniel said dismissively. But it's a rental property, I pointed out. Why would they do that? Let's just get inside, Daniel said quickly. The front door creaked open easily, and a gust of freezing air swept out to meet us. The inside was eerily quiet, the only sound the wind rattling against the boarded windows. Cozy, Clara muttered sarcastically as she set her bag down. The main room was sparsely furnished, an old couch, a small wood-burning stove, and a table with mismatched chairs. A single oil lamp sat in the center, its flame flickering weakly. This is going to be great, Daniel said, trying to sound enthusiastic as he rubbed his hands together. Just us, nature, and no distractions. I exchanged a look with Clara, who rolled her eyes. The first night passed uneventfully, though the storm showed no signs of letting up. By the second day, the snow had piled so high it blocked the front door. Guess we're snowed in, Daniel said cheerfully as he poked at the stove. We should have brought more firewood, Clara grumbled. I glanced out the small crack in the boarded window. The forest was barely visible through the blizzard, the trees swaying violently in the wind. I thought I saw someone, I said suddenly, my voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked up. Where? By the tree lean, I said, pointing. I saw movement. It's just the wind, Clara said, her tone flat. But I noticed the way her hand tightened around her coffee mug. That night, the lodge grew colder. The fire barely seemed to warm the room, and the lamp's flame dimmed, though there was no draft. Did anyone else hear that? Clara asked suddenly. Hear what? Daniel said, his voice a little too casual. Footsteps, she said. Outside. Probably just the snow settling, Daniel replied, though he didn't sound convinced. We listened, the silence stretching uncomfortably long. Then, faintly, there it was. A crunching sound, slow and deliberate, moving around the lodge. The next morning, we found the footprints. They circled the building but never led away, not back to the treeline, not anywhere. This doesn't make sense, Clara whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. Maybe it's an animal? Daniel offered weakly. An animal with boots? Clara shot back. I crouched down, tracing the edge of the nearest print with my gloved hand. They were deep, perfectly formed, as if someone had been standing just outside the window all night. That evening, the storm intensified, and so did the sounds. There it is again, Clara whispered as we sat huddled near the stove. The crunching footsteps were louder now, accompanied by faint knocking sounds, as if someone, or something, was tapping on the walls. I'm going out there, Daniel announced, grabbing a flashlight. Are you insane? Clara hissed. We need to know what's going on, he snapped. Daniel, wait, I said, grabbing his arm. Let's stick together. The three of us stepped into the storm, the flashlight beam cutting weakly through the swirling snow. The forest loomed around us, dark and impenetrable. Hello? Daniel called out. The wind howled in response. Let's go back inside, Clara said urgently, pulling at my sleeve. But Daniel was already moving toward the treeline. Daniel, stop. I called after him. He froze suddenly, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Do you see that? I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Just beyond the edge of the light stood a figure. Tall, thin, with unnaturally long limbs. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. What the hell? Clara whispered. The figure tilted its head, as if curious. Then it stepped forward. Run! Daniel shouted, but it was too late. The light flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. We stumbled back into the lodge, slamming the door behind us. What was that? See. Daniel didn't answer. He was staring at the boarded window, his F.A. Daniel, I said, stepping closer. They are. What are you talking about? I asked. They were never outside, he said, his eyes wide. They've been in here the whole time. As if on cue, the lamp flickered and went out. In the darkness, the sound of footsteps began again, this time slow and deliberate, coming from the second floor. We froze, too scared to breathe. Then, from the shadows above, a voice called out, soft and distorted. Why didn't you stay away? The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. One by one. And then, silence. The storm outside howled louder, but the lodge fell eerily still. We never saw what came down those stairs. But when the search team found the lodge 3 days later, it was empty, the fire still burning faintly in the stove, as if we'd never been there at all. Story 3. The bus was late, as usual. Snow piled higher by the minute, blanketing the streets in eerie silence. As the storm howled, a few of us stood shivering under the weak glow of the streetlights. Do you think it's coming? An older woman muttered, pulling her scarf tighter. It has to, a man beside her replied, glancing nervously down the road. But in this weather. No way it's on time, added a young woman near the back of the group. Her friend didn't look up from her phone, the cold blue glow of the screen lighting her bored expression. When the bus finally arrived, its headlights barely cut through the snow. The driver opened the doors without a word, his face shadowed under his cap. We climbed aboard, grateful for the faint warmth inside. I sat midway down, choosing a seat by the window. The young woman and her friend sat a few rows ahead of me, while the older woman and the man sat closer to the front. The bus groaned as it pulled away, leaving behind the familiar streets of the city. It wasn't long before the tension in the air became palpable. "Do you feel that?" the young woman whispered, leaning toward her friend. "Feel what?" her friend asked, not looking up from her phone. "The air, it feels heavy. Like, it's pressing down on me. Maybe you're just cold." "No," the young woman insisted, her voice more urgent. "It feels wrong." The older woman turned slightly in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "What's she talking about?" she asked the man beside her. He shrugged but didn't answer. His gaze was fixed out the window, watching the snow swirl in the dim streetlights. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. The air did feel colder, and the warmth of the bus seemed to fade with every mile. The bus lights flickered. "Whoa, what was that?" the young woman asked, sitting up straight. "Relax, it's just the storm," her friend replied, though her voice wavered. The man near the front finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Storms like this, they do strange things. They make you see things that aren't there." The older woman frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means we should mind our own business," he said, his tone sharp. But the young woman wasn't listening. She was staring out the window, her breath fogging the glass. "There's someone out there," she whispered. Her friend scoffed. "It's snow. You're seeing shadows." "No," the young woman said firmly, her voice trembling. "There's a figure, standing by the trees." I leaned forward, trying to see what she was talking about. The bus was passing a small park, its skeletal trees barely visible through the storm. And then I saw it, a dark figure, unnaturally tall and still, standing just at the edge of the tree line. "Did you see it?" the young woman asked, turning to me. I nodded slowly. "What are you all looking at?" the older woman asked, craning her neck. "There's nothing out there," the man said firmly. But he avoided looking out the window. The bus lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. "See," the man said, his voice rising slightly. "It's just your imagination." "It's not," the young woman said. "I swear it was there." The driver muttered something under his breath, catching our attention. "What's that?" the older woman called out. The driver didn't answer. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time. "What's going on?" "Everyone sit down," the driver snapped. His voice was tight, almost panicked. The young woman turned to her friend, whispering, "Why is he so nervous?" "Maybe because of the storm," her friend suggested weakly. But the young woman shook her head. "No. It's something else. He's scared." A loud thud jolted the bus, and the lights went out completely. "What was that?" the older woman cried, clutching her bag. "Driver, what's happening?" the man shouted. The driver didn't respond. The bus slowed to a crawl, and the only light came from the weak glow of the emergency exit signs. "I don't like this," the young woman whispered, her voice trembling. Another thud echoed through the bus, this time from the roof. "Oh my God," her friend whispered, finally looking up from her phone. "It's just debris," the man said quickly, though his voice shook. "No, it's not," the young woman said. "It's footsteps." The sound moved along the roof, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. "Driver, stop the bus," the man demanded. The driver didn't move. "Did you hear me?" the man shouted, standing. The young woman grabbed her friend's arm. "Something's wrong." We need to get off. We can't get off in the middle of the storm, her friend protested. The older woman started muttering a prayer under her breath. Suddenly, the footsteps started again, but this time they weren't on the roof. They were inside. "Who's there?" the man shouted, spinning around. The sound was faint, coming from the back of the bus. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on something that shouldn't have been there. "Stay together," the young woman whispered. "Stay calm," the man added, though his voice cracked. The footsteps stopped near the rear door. "Hello?" the young woman called out, her voice shaking. A long, eerie silence followed. Then, a low, guttural whisper came from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come." The lights flickered back on for just a moment, and I saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing at the back of the bus. Its head tilted, its eyeless face staring directly at us. The lights went out again, plunging us into darkness. "Run!" the man shouted. But the bus wasn't moving anymore. And neither were we. When I woke up, I was alone. The bus was empty, the storm had cleared, and the only sign of the others were faint footprints leading into the trees. To this day, I still hear the whisper in my dreams. "You shouldn't have come." Story 4. The storm came in waves that night, blanketing the city in a deafening silence. I was one of the last to leave Harper Hall, a crumbling theater famous for its strange history. The hall had a reputation, whispers of shadows that moved on their own, strange knocks when no one was there. But tonight, the storm made everything worse. "You sure you don't want me to wait?" Carla asked, pulling her coat tight. She lingered at the exit, the cold wind snapping at the edges of her scarf. "I'll be fine," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I just need to secure the props in the rigging loft." "You should go before the roads get worse." Carla hesitated. "Ella, seriously, don't stay too long. This place gives me the creeps after dark." I laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I've got my phone. I'll call if I need anything." Carla frowned. "You better. And don't go poking around where you don't need to. Harper's got secrets." The loft was colder than I remembered, the air sharp and biting. The single light bulb in the corner flickered weakly, casting the pulleys and ropes in long, jagged shadows. I was halfway through securing a backdrop when I heard it. "Ella." The whisper was faint, barely more than the sound of the wind outside. "Carla?" I called out, glancing toward the door. "If you're messing with me, it's not funny." No answer. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "Ella, come down." I froze. The loft was empty, but the shadows felt wrong, like they were shifting when I wasn't looking. "All right, very funny," I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who's there?" Still nothing. Then a scraping sound echoed from the far corner of the loft, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Carla, I swear." "It's not Carla," a voice interrupted from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. There was no one there. The door to the loft creaked open, and Carla stepped inside, her face pale. "What the hell are you yelling about?" she asked, glancing around nervously. "I thought you left," I said, my voice shaking. "I did," Carla said. But then I heard, she trailed off, staring at the far corner of the loft. "Ella, who were you talking to?" "No one," I whispered. "But someone's up here." I heard them. Carla's eyes narrowed. "You're serious?" Before I could answer, the scraping sound came again, louder this time. Carla grabbed my arm. "We're leaving. Right now." As we descended the stairs, the theater seemed alive. The walls groaned as if under some unseen weight, and the air grew colder with every step. "Ella," Carla whispered. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked, though I already knew. The whisper was faint but unmistakable. Come down, come down. We stopped in our tracks, glancing at each other. What is that? Carla hissed. I don't know, I said. It's been happening since you left. I thought it was you. Why would I be whispering like a creep? She snapped, her voice breaking. The whisper came again, this time from directly below us. Keep moving, Carla said, her grip on my arm tightening. When we reached the stage, we both froze. The chairs in the audience had been stacked into a towering, impossible pile in the center of the theater. What the hell? Carla whispered. I didn't hear anyone down here, I said, my voice trembling. How could they have done this so quietly? We need to go, Carla said firmly. I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the ghost light, a single bulb we always left on when the theater was empty. It flickered weakly, casting long, unnatural shadows. Ella, Carla said, pulling at my sleeve. We're leaving. Now. What if someone's still here? I asked. That's exactly why we need to leave, Carla snapped. Before we could take another step, the whisper turned into laughter, low, guttural, and echoing from every corner of the theater. Do you see it? Carla whispered, pointing toward the pile of chairs. My breath caught. Among the shadows, a figure stood motionless, its long, thin frame bending unnaturally. Its head tilted, and two hollow pits where eyes should have been seemed to focus on us. Is that a person? I stammered. The figure moved, stepping forward without sound. Run, Carla whispered. What? Run, she screamed, pulling me toward the exit. We burst into the storm, the cold air cutting through us like a knife. Carla didn't stop until we were halfway down the street, gasping for breath. What was that? I demanded. Carla shook her head. I don't know. I don't want to know. When I looked back, the theater was dark, its windows glowing faintly through the boarded-up panes. Ella, Carla said, her voice trembling. Do you think it's still watching? I didn't answer. But sometimes, on cold, stormy nights, I hear that whisper again. Ella, come down. Story 5. The storm had hit harder than expected, and by the time we reached Pinecrest Lodge, the snow was already knee-deep. The old cabin stood alone at the edge of the forest, its silhouette barely visible against the whiteout. It had taken Luke months to renovate the place. This is it, he said, his voice tinged with pride. A little work and a lot of charm. I wasn't convinced. The cabin looked more haunted than charming, with its sagging roof and frost-covered window. Are you sure this is safe? I asked, eyeing the icy. It's sturdy, Luke replied, hauling our bags onto the porch. Trust me, this P. Inside, the lodge was warm, thanks to the fire Luke had started earlier. The smell of cedar and fresh paint lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of pine. Cozy, right? Luke said, setting down our bags. It's something, I said, forcing a smile. That's just the storm talking, he said with a laugh. Wait until morning. You'll see. By nightfall, the storm had grown fiercer. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. Luke stoked the fire and handed me a mug of hot cocoa. Here's to the start of our weekend adventure, he said. I raised my mug, but before I could take a sip, the lights flickered. Power's probably out, Luke said casually. I'll check the generator. Do you really think it's a good idea to go out there? I asked, glancing at the storm outside. I'll be fine, he said, grabbing his flashlight. Stay here and keep the fire going. Minutes turned into an hour, and Luke still hadn't returned. I paced the room, the shadows cast by the fire flickering ominously against the walls. Luke? I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. Grabbing my coat, I stepped outside. The cold hit me like a slap, the snow whipping around me in wild spirals. The generator shed was a short walk from the cabin, but it felt like miles in the blizzard. When I finally reached it, the shed door was ajar, snow blowing inside. "Luke?" I called, stepping in. The flashlight he'd taken was lying on the ground, its beam flickering weakly. But there was no sign of him. Then I noticed the footprints. They led away from the shed and into the forest, deep and deliberate. Why would he go into the woods? I muttered, my breath visible in the freezing air. I followed the tracks, each step more difficult than the last. The snow clung to my boots, and the cold gnawed at my exposed skin. The forest loomed around me, dark and foreboding. "Luke!" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response. The footprints stopped suddenly, ending in a small clearing. I turned in circles, scanning the area. "Luke! This isn't funny." Then I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, a figure stood motionless. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. The snow swirled around it, but it didn't move. "Luke?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't him. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice wavered. It didn't stop. Panicking, I turned and ran, the snow grabbing at my legs with every step. I didn't stop until the cabin came into view, its warm light a beacon in the storm. Slamming the door behind me, I locked it and pressed my back against the wood, gasping for breath. "Luke," I whispered. "Where are you?" The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. I moved to stoke it when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps at the door. "Luke?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Another knock, louder this time. I crept to the door, peering through the small frosted window. The figure was standing there, its hollow eyes fixed on me. My breath caught, and I stumbled back. "Go away!" I shouted. The knocking stopped, replaced by a voice. Low, guttural, and echoing. "Let me in." The room grew colder, the fire sputtering as if the storm itself had crept inside. The knocking resumed, faster and more insistent. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. Then, silence. For a moment, all I could hear was the wind outside and my own ragged breathing. I turned back to the window, but the figure was gone. Morning came, and with it, an eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in snow. I searched the area around the cabin, calling for Luke. But there was no trace of him, only a single set of footprints leading into the forest and disappearing at the clearing. I never found him. But sometimes, on stormy nights, I hear the knocking again. And a voice whispers through the wind. "Let me in." Story 6. The snowstorm came in fast and hard, transforming the small mountain town of Greywood into a silent, snow-draped prison. I was heading to my uncle's cabin, a place I hadn't visited since I was a child. He'd passed away a few weeks earlier, and the lawyer had insisted I visit to handle some final affairs. "You'll be fine, Jenna," my friend Mia had said before I left. "It's just one night. What's the worst that could happen?" Looking at the darkened, isolated cabin now, I couldn't help but wonder if I should have stayed home. The inside of the cabin was colder than I remembered. It had the unmistakable smell of damp wood and neglect. As I lit the fireplace, my phone buzzed with a text from Mia. "Made it?" I replied quickly. "Yeah. Feels weird being here alone." She replied almost instantly. "You're never alone in those old places." Winking face. I rolled my eyes and put the phone away. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the windows. I was unpacking when I noticed it, a small notebook on the coffee table. It was my uncle's handwriting. "You can't trust them." That was the only sentence on the page. Can't trust who? I muttered to myself. Before I could think too much about it, there was a knock at the door. Standing in the swirling snow was a man in a heavy coat and beanie. His face was partially obscured by a scarf, but his eyes were sharp and piercing. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice muffled. "My car broke down a mile back. Do you mind if I wait out the storm here?" I hesitated. The storm was brutal, and he looked genuinely desperate. "Sure," I said reluctantly. "Come in." He stepped inside, brushing snow off his coat. "Thank you," he said, his breath fogging the air. "Name's Mark." "Jenna," I replied. As the evening dragged on, Mark proved to be pleasant enough. We shared a meal of canned soup by the fire, and he talked about his job as a wildlife photographer. But something about him felt off. He avoided questions about why he was out in the storm and seemed overly interested in the cabin. "This place has history," he said, leaning back in the chair. "Did you know about the murder?" I froze. "What murder?" "A woman," he said. "Found here. About 10 years ago. They never caught who did it." "That's not true," I said, my voice shaking. "Oh, it's true," he said, smiling faintly. Later that night, as the storm raged on, I couldn't sleep. Mark's words echoed in my head. "Murder? Here?" My uncle had never mentioned anything like that. I decided to distract myself by going through some of his papers. That's when I found it, a faded police report, buried under a pile of old letters. Victim, Emily Greaves. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. Location, cabin. My stomach turned. Couldn't sleep. I spun around. Mark was standing in the doorway, his face half-lit by the firelight. "What are you doing up?" I asked, clutching the papers to my chest. "Same as you," he said, stepping closer. "Trying to piece things together." "What are you talking about?" He tilted his head, his smile cold. "You really don't know, do you?" Mark sat across from me at the table, his demeanor shifting from friendly to calculating. "Your uncle," he said, tapping the police report. "He was the main suspect." "That's a lie," I snapped. "Is it?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "Think about it. He was the only one here when she died. The case went cold because no one could prove it, but everyone in town knew." I shook my head. "You're making this up." Mark leaned in, his voice lowering. "What if I told you he wasn't the only one involved?" "What do you mean?" He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say some secrets are worth killing for." The power went out suddenly, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Great," I muttered, fumbling for my flashlight. Mark stood, his silhouette barely visible in the faint glow of the fire. "I'll check the breaker," he said. I didn't trust him, but I nodded. "Fine. It's in the back." As soon as he left, I grabbed my phone. No service. I glanced at the police report again, noticing something I hadn't before. In the margin was a scribbled note, "Not alone. He knows." A crash from the back of the cabin made me jump. "Mark?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron poker, and made my way toward the noise. The breaker room door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, Mark was slumped against the wall, blood pooling beneath him. "Oh my God," I whispered, dropping the poker. His eyes fluttered open. "It wasn't me," he gasped, his voice weak. "It's still here." What are you talking about? Before he could answer, his head slumped forward, and he went still. I stumbled back into the living room, my mind racing. Still here. The storm outside howled louder, and then I heard it. A soft creak from the stairs. Hello? I called out, gripping the poker tightly. A shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. You shouldn't have come back, a voice whispered, low and chilling. I spun around, but there was no one there. When the storm cleared the next morning, the police found me sitting on the porch, shivering and clutching the poker. Mark's body was in the breaker room, just as I'd left it. But there was no sign of anyone else. The police asked me questions, but I didn't have answers. All I knew was this: whatever happened in that cabin 10 years ago, it wasn't finished. And it was waiting for me. Story 7. The storm was relentless, a thick curtain of snow that erased the world beyond a few feet ahead. My coworker Ethan and I had just finished inspecting the old radio tower on Ridgecrest Peak. The place had been abandoned for years, and our job was simple: confirm it was structurally sound for demolition. But nothing about that night felt simple. Are you sure the road's this way? Ethan asked, his voice muffled by his scarf. I marked it on the GPS, I replied, though I wasn't as confident as I sounded. The storm made the forest unrecognizable. The towering pines swayed menacingly, and the snow absorbed every sound except the crunch of our boots. We should have stayed at the tower, Ethan muttered. You wanted to leave, I shot back. That was before the wind started sounding like voices, he said, glancing over his shoulder. We trudged on, the weight of our gear slowing us down. My flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Stop, Ethan said suddenly, grabbing my arm. What? Do you hear that? I strained to listen. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Probably just a branch hitting a tree, I said, more to reassure myself than him. Branches don't echo like that, Ethan whispered. The tapping grew louder, closer. Let's pick up the pace, I said, trying to sound calm. Ethan didn't argue. We stumbled into a small clearing, the snow-covered ground interrupted by a strange, circular depression. In the center was a single wooden post, standing unnaturally upright despite the wind. What the hell is this? Ethan asked, shining his flashlight on it. Carved into the post were strange symbols, worn but still visible. I don't know, I admitted, though unease crawled up my spine. Ethan knelt, brushing snow away from the base. He pulled out a rusted metal box. Don't open it, I said quickly. Why not? Just, don't. Ethan hesitated, then stood, holding the box tightly. We'll check it later. The tapping resumed, louder and faster now, like it was chasing us. It's following us, Ethan said, panic creeping into his voice. Keep moving, I urged. The wind carried whispers, faint and incomprehensible. The forest felt alive, the trees bending as if to block our path. Ethan stopped abruptly, his flashlight shaking. What's wrong? I asked. Look, he whispered, pointing ahead. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the snow. It was tall, too tall, with arms that hung unnaturally long at its sides. Who's there? I called out. The figure didn't move. Let's go back, Ethan said, stepping away. No, I said firmly. We have to keep going. The figure vanished as suddenly as it appeared. Did you see its face? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. There wasn't one, I whispered. We pushed forward, the oppressive silence broken only by the tapping, now accompanied by the crunch of footsteps behind us. We're being followed, Ethan said, his voice barely audible. I didn't reply. I knew he was right. We reached an old ranger's cabin, its windows dark and frosted over. "Inside," I said, shoving the door open. The cabin was cold and empty, dust covering every surface. Ethan dropped the box on the table, his hands shaking. "Are you going to open it now?" I asked. Ethan nodded, prying the lid open with his knife. Inside was a collection of photographs, each one depicting the same figure we'd seen in the forest. "What the hell is this?" Ethan whispered. The last photo was different. It showed two people standing in the snow, us. The cabin door slammed shut, the wind outside howling louder. "What was that?" Ethan said, spinning around. I moved to the window, peering out. The figure was there, standing just beyond the tree line, its eyeless face turned toward the cabin. "It's here," I said, my voice trembling. Ethan grabbed the box and threw it into the fireplace, setting it alight. "Maybe that'll stop it," he said. The whispers outside turned to screams, loud and guttural, shaking the cabin's walls. The fire sputtered out, plunging the cabin into darkness. "Stay close," I said, gripping Ethan's arm. The figure was inside now, its presence felt rather than seen. "Why us?" Ethan whispered. A voice answered, low and chilling. "You opened the door." The lights flickered on briefly, and I saw it, a hand, impossibly long and skeletal, wrapping around Ethan's neck. "Run," he shouted, struggling against its grip. I froze, unable to move as the figure dragged him into the shadows. "Go!" Ethan screamed one last time before the light flickered out again, and the cabin fell silent. I stumbled out into the storm, the wind deafening. The forest was empty, the tapping gone. When search teams arrived the next morning, they found no trace of Ethan or the cabin. But sometimes, on snowy nights, I hear the tapping again. And I know it's still waiting. Story 8. The snow was falling harder than expected when I picked up Kara from her apartment. She'd insisted on a winter hike despite the forecast, calling it the perfect way to escape the monotony of city life. "Nothing clears your head like nature," she said, tossing her backpack into the back seat. "Nothing screams bad idea like a snowstorm in the middle of nowhere," I muttered, turning onto the winding road leading to Blackwood Trail. Kara rolled her eyes. "We'll be fine. It's just snow." The trailhead was deserted when we arrived. Thick flakes blanketed the ground, muffling every sound except the crunch of our boots. The towering pines loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow. "This is amazing," Kara said, snapping photos with her phone. I wasn't so sure. The forest felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. "We should stick close to the main path," I said, glancing at the map. "Relax," Kara replied. "I've been here before. Just follow me." An hour into the hike, the trail began to narrow. The snow was deeper now, and the wind howled through the trees like a living thing. "You sure we're going the right way?" I asked. "Of course," Kara said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. We rounded a bend and found ourselves in a small clearing. In the center stood a weathered signpost, its lettering faded and unreadable. "What is this?" I asked, shining my flashlight on it. Kara frowned. "It wasn't here last time." "Let's turn back," I suggested. "No way," she said. "We've come too far." As we pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead and blocking out what little light remained. "I don't like this," I said, stopping in my tracks. Kara turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You're not scared, are you?" "Something doesn't feel right," I admitted. Before she could respond, a sound echoed through the trees, a low, guttural groan. "What was that?" Kara whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. "I don't know," I said, gripping the flashlight tighter. The sound came again, closer this time. It was followed by the crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate. "Someone's out there," Kara said, her voice trembling. "Let's go back," I said, pulling her arm. But before we could move, a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall and gaunt, his face obscured by a hood. His clothes were ragged, and his hands were covered in what looked like dried blood. "Lost?" he asked, his voice raspy. "We're fine," Kara said quickly. "Just heading back to the trailhead." The man tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "This isn't a place you just pass through." "Thanks for the advice," I said, edging toward the path. "We'll be going now." The man didn't move. "You found the post," he said, his tone dark. "What post?" Kara asked, her voice shaking. "The marker," he replied. "It's a boundary." "A boundary for what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "For those who belong," he said, stepping closer. "And those who don't." Kara and I turned and ran, the snow slowing our escape. The wind carried his laughter, cold and cruel, chasing us through the trees. "We need to hide," Kara shouted, pulling me toward a cluster of rocks. We crouched behind the boulders, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. "What is happening?" I whispered. Kara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know." The sound of footsteps drew closer, the man's shadow stretching across the snow. "Kara," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned to me, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm sorry," she said. Before I could ask what she meant, she shoved me hard, sending me tumbling into the snow. The man appeared above me, his hood pulled back to reveal a face twisted with rage. "She brought you here," he said, raising a blade. "But it's you who doesn't belong." I kicked out, knocking him off balance, and scrambled to my feet. "Kara!" I shouted, but she was gone. The man lunged at me again, his blade catching the moonlight. I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with all my strength, striking him across the head. He collapsed into the snow, his body eerily still. I stumbled back to the clearing, the snowstorm raging around me. Kara was there, standing by the post, her face pale and haunted. "What did you do?" I demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, she held up a small, blood-stained charm. "It wasn't supposed to be you," she said, her voice breaking. "He needed someone to cross." "You knew this would happen?" I asked, my anger rising. Tears streamed down her face. "I didn't have a choice." The wind howled, carrying the man's laughter once more. The post began to glow faintly, and Kara backed away, dropping the charm. "I'm sorry," she whispered before disappearing into the forest. By the time I reached the trailhead, the storm had subsided. When the authorities arrived, they found no trace of Kara, the man, or the clearing. But every time I look at my reflection, I see him, his face staring back at me. And I know the boundary wasn't meant to be crossed. Story 9. The snowstorm came without warning, swallowing the small mountain town of Crestfall in a relentless white blanket. I was supposed to meet my old friend Andrew at the Pine Ridge Lookout, a spot we used to hike to as teenagers. It had been years since I'd seen him, and his message that morning had been oddly cryptic. "We need to talk. Meet me at the ridge at 8 p.m. Bring a flashlight." It was nearly 9 p.m. when I arrived, the trail barely visible beneath the fresh snow. The only sign of life was the faint glow of an old lantern hanging from a crooked post at the trailhead. "Andrew?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the howling wind. No response. Pulling my coat tighter, I started up the trail. The snow crunched beneath my boots, each step heavier than the last. The trees loomed tall and silent, their branches sagging under the weight of the storm. Halfway up, I spotted him. Andrew stood by a small clearing, his back to me, the lantern's light casting long, flickering shadows. "You're late," he said without turning around. "Traffic," I replied, trying to sound casual. And the snow didn't help. He finally turned, his face pale and drawn. "We shouldn't have come back here." "What's going on, Andrew?" I asked, stepping closer. He glanced at the trees, his eyes darting as if he expected something to emerge from the shadows. "Do you remember the last time we were here?" "Of course," I said. "The ridge was our escape." "What about it?" Andrew hesitated, his breath visible in the freezing air. "You ever wonder why we stopped coming?" I frowned. "We grew up. Life happened." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It was because of what happened to Lily." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Lily had been our friend, the third member of our little group. She disappeared during a hike up here 10 years ago. The search teams never found her. "Why are you bringing this up now?" I asked, my voice tight. Andrew pulled a small object from his pocket, a worn, silver locket. "I found this on my doorstep last night." My blood ran cold. Lily had always worn that locket. "That's impossible," I said. "Is it?" Andrew's voice cracked. "Because ever since I got it, I've been hearing her. At night. Calling my name." "You're just imagining things," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Andrew stepped closer, his eyes desperate. "You don't understand. She's here." The wind picked up, whipping the snow into wild spirals. A faint whisper carried through the air, just loud enough to be unsettling. "Did you hear that?" Andrew asked, clutching the locket tightly. I nodded, my heart pounding. "It's just the wind." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's her." The whisper grew louder, taking on a familiar cadence. "Andrew." We both froze. The voice was unmistakable. "Lily?" I called out, my breath catching. The whisper turned into a soft laugh, echoing through the trees. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice trembling. Andrew pointed toward the ridge. "She wants us to follow." "This is insane," I said. "We should go back." "Go if you want," Andrew said, starting up the trail. "But I need answers." Cursing under my breath, I followed him. The ridge was more desolate than I remembered. The snow had erased all traces of the past, leaving only the jagged rocks and the faint outline of a fire pit we'd once used. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, shrouded in shadows. "Lily?" Andrew called, stepping forward. The figure turned slowly. It wasn't Lily. The woman's face was gaunt, her skin pale as the snow around her. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach them. "You came back," she said, her voice a chilling mix of delight and malice. Andrew froze, the locket slipping from his fingers. "Who are you?" I demanded, gripping Andrew's arm. The woman's smile widened. "You don't remember me?" Andrew shook his head. "No. I." She stepped closer, her movements unnatural, almost jerky. "You should. You left me here." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Andrew's breathing grew shallow. "It's her, it's Lily." "No," I said firmly. "That's not Lily." The woman tilted her head. "But I am." The ground beneath us shifted, the snow revealing dark, frozen earth. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "You left me," the woman said, her tone turning venomous. Andrew fell to his knees, clutching his head. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "What did you do?" I demanded, grabbing his shoulders. Andrew sobbed. "We were arguing. She tripped. I didn't help her." The woman's laughter turned into a shriek. You didn't help me. The shadows closed in, and the air grew frigid. Andrew screamed as the woman lunged at him, her hands clawing into his chest. Stop! I shouted, trying to pull her off him. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw Lily's face, filled with pain and betrayal. This is justice, she whispered. With a final, ear-splitting scream, the snow swallowed them both. I stumbled back to the trailhead, the lantern's glow guiding me through the storm. When the authorities arrived, they found no trace of Andrew or the clearing. But the lantern still hangs there, its light never fading. And on quiet, snowy nights, I hear her whispering my name. Story 10. The snowstorm had been raging for hours, silencing the city and transforming it into an unrecognizable labyrinth of white. I was the only one still at the old radio station on the outskirts of town. WZNR 97.5 FM had been off the air for years, but tonight, the station's signal inexplicably came back to life. Come back, the text from my coworker Jordan had read. Something's broadcasting. You need to hear it. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty except for Jordan's car. The station loomed ahead, its dark windows reflecting the faint glow of the snow-covered landscape. Inside, the place was colder than outside. I found Jordan in the control room, hunched over the equipment. You hear it yet? He asked, not bothering to look up. Hear what? I asked, shaking the snow from my coat. He hit a button, and static filled the room. Just wait, he said, his voice tinged with unease. At first, it was just the hiss of dead air. Then, faintly, a voice emerged. Calling all listeners. If you can hear this, you're already too late. The voice was distorted, otherworldly. What is this? I asked, leaning closer. Jordan shook his head. That's the thing, I don't know. The equipment's not even connected. This signal isn't coming from us. We sat in silence as the voice continued, growing clearer with each passing second. They're here. They've always been here. And tonight, they're coming for you. Is this a prank? I asked, glancing nervously at Jordan. I thought so too, he said. But look at this. He pointed to the frequency display. It was flickering, cycling through numbers faster than I could track. That's not possible, I said. And yet, Jordan replied, his face pale. The lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed through the building. What was that? I asked, my pulse quickening. Jordan grabbed a flashlight. Let's check the generator. The hallway was darker than I remembered, the storm outside casting strange shadows through the frosted windows. I don't like this, I muttered. Neither do I, Jordan admitted, leading the way. We reached the generator room, but it was empty. Nothing's wrong with it, Jordan said, inspecting the machinery. Another bang came from above us, followed by the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. Someone's here, I whispered. Jordan nodded, gripping the flashlight tighter. Back in the control room, the voice had changed. It was louder now, more urgent. They're watching. They know you're listening. Run while you still can. What the hell is going on? I asked, my voice trembling. Jordan pointed to the monitor. The signal strength was spiking, the screen displaying erratic waves that seemed almost alive. This isn't just a broadcast, he said. It's a warning. The lights flickered again, plunging the station into darkness. Stay close, Jordan said, his voice barely audible. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it felt like the building itself was vibrating. Do you see that? Jordan whispered, pointing toward the hallway. A faint glow was emanating from the far end, pulsing like a heartbeat. We need to leave, I said, pulling at his arm. But Jordan shook his head. We have to know what it is. We followed the glow, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, our breaths visible in the faint light. At the end of the hallway was the storage room. The door was ajar, and the glow was seeping out like liquid light. Jordan pushed the door open, and we froze. Inside was a large, old radio tower antenna. It shouldn't have been there, the station had no such equipment. "It's broadcasting," Jordan said, stepping closer. The glow intensified, and the hum turned into a deafening roar. "Jordan, don't," I started, but it was too late. As he touched the antenna, the room exploded with light. I was thrown backward, hitting the wall hard. When I opened my eyes, the glow was gone, and so was Jordan. "Jordan!" I called out, scrambling to my feet. The only response was the voice, now coming from every speaker in the building. "He's gone. And so are you." The lights flickered back on, revealing a room I didn't recognize. The walls were covered in symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. The voice continued, now directly addressing me. "You shouldn't have stayed. Now they know you're here." I ran toward the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I screamed. The voice laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the empty station. "There's no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone." The last thing I saw before the lights went out was a figure standing in the corner, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light as the antenna. The next morning, the station was silent. The authorities found no trace of Jordan or me, only the faint hum of a signal that no one could trace. And somewhere, faint and distorted, the voice continues to broadcast. "If you can hear this, it's already too late."